Cloud. Welcome to Storm Politics. Thank you for watching today on WYLN TV, and a special hello to those watching online at WYLNTV.com. War isn't over just because it's over. It's estimated that 1/3 of returning combat soldiers suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. PTSD does not only affect the soldier, it can affect the soldier's family as well, for they are the ones who help the soldier try to reintegrate into civilian life, a transition that often comes with great stress for all. Today, I'm honored to discuss this important topic with two nationally recognized figures. First, Ashely Wise, CEO of Battling Bear, a military wife whose husband suffers from PTSD. She bared a part of her body to raise public awareness about it. That singular move has become a national movement, as thousands of military spouses all over our nation are doing the same. And surprise, surprise, I posed for Battling Bear on October 25th, and you'll get to see the photo on their Facebook page, and I will share it with you today. Second, I interviewed Tony Seahorn, author of the highly acclaimed book, Tears of a Warrior. With over 200,000 copies in circulation, it's available at all veterans centers, VA hospitals, and PTSD facilities nationwide. Seahorn is not only an author, he is a decorated combat veteran, having served us honorably in Vietnam with the Black Lions Infantry Division. He is the recipient of 2 Bronze Stars for heroism, 2 Purple Hearts, the Air Medal for Valor, the Vietnamese Gallantry Cross, and a Presidential Unit Citation. He has experienced real combat, real trauma, having fought in some of the bloodiest battles in Vietnam, and he continues to recover from both the physical and emotional scars of war. Today, we thank our veterans and their families as we remember there is still an emotional war being fought by thousands every day. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Storm Politics for a very exciting discussion about post-traumatic stress disorder. My first guest, Ashely Wise, created a national sensation when she bared her back to generate PTSD awareness. She is a military wife, and she joins me today. Ashely, thank you so much for calling into the show.
Hey, no problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I think what you've done is fantastic, and I'd like if you could share a bit of your story as to how PTSD has personally touched your life.
Well, okay, my husband was, whenever he and I got together, he had already been serving for about 12 years. The first 8 years were in the Marine Corps, and then he switched over to the Army. And he'd already been deployed once to Afghanistan and deployed the second time whenever we were dating. And basically, to say all that, I've never known Rob without PTSD. And finally, there were different things throughout, the last several years, and most especially after we PCS'd from Fort Lewis down here to Fort Campbell, that my husband really started to be triggered more and more, and spiraled downhill, and he ended up turning into a man that I really didn't know who he was anymore. October 2011, he disappeared to a hotel room with all of the weapons that we owned and 2 cases of beer. And when I finally got in touch with him, he said he might do something stupid. Life was just really, really hard. And then this last March, after finding that his friend Bobby Bales snapped in Afghanistan and allegedly killed those 16 civilians, he began repeating behaviors that he had leading up to the hotel incident the October before.
And sadly, Ashely, your story is not unique in the standpoint of so many military spouses are dealing with spouses home from war, and they are doing these very things.
Exactly. And, it's funny because, they get home and you have all these reintegration briefs leading up to them coming home. And it seems like it takes about 6 weeks to 6 months for them to really be home and start, cooling off. And then it's when the honeymoon period is over, if you will, that's whenever you start seeing these erratic behaviors and the spending sprees and the, I call them temper tantrums, but whenever they're just angry for no reason, the grouchy bear syndrome. And basically, I'd been living with this, thinking I was crazy, being told by my family I was codependent, why did I stay, Rob's a jerk, all that kind of stuff. So we had tried multiple different services, including the Army substance abuse program that didn't work, and then MFLAC, which is the Military Family Life Advocacy Counseling, which unfortunately for us, we got a really bad counselor. There are some fantastic MFLACs out there. And as a last-ditch effort, I went over to family advocacy, and instead of getting the help that I needed, I was manipulated, I was lied to, and I ended up involuntarily charging my husband, signing a sworn statement that allowed them to charge my husband with domestic assault. And whenever I went back to say that's not what I wanted, you lied to me, I was told I was behaving like a typical beaten woman, and then it was out of my hands. And at that point, I started sharing my story, realizing that there were women that were facing horrible situations because their husbands suffered from undiagnosed PTSD, but they didn't want to say anything because they were going to end up in the same situation I was, facing domestic assault charges and dishonorable discharge.
So let me ask you this, Ashely. How do you go from there to coming up with the idea that I'm going to take off my shirt, bare my back, and write a poem or something, a statement on my back about PTSD and standing by my spouse? How did that idea enter your brain? I
got off the phone with Command Sergeant Major Smith's office. He is the 101st Airborne Division Command Sergeant Major, and I was told that they could not get involved because it was a conflict of interest. And I had already been laughed at by an MP, and I was very, very angry. And I jokingly said to my neighbor, I feel like streaking the 101st Airborne Division command building because maybe a naked woman would get their attention.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Well, and you certainly have gotten attention. I mean, you have not only become a national sensation and spokesperson and advocate for PTSD, you're actually known internationally as well, which is just extraordinary in the short time that you've been doing this.
Yes, it's a God thing, really. I mean, I didn't plan any of it, and it's been an incredibly humbling journey because, you know, I'm credited for writing those words, and really, you know, it was a God thing. The image for the picture and the pledge all came to me, and the way that it has touched the souls of so many people, you know, I have no words. I've heard from
Well, I'd like to also just share with the audience what the words are. It's broken by battle, wounded by war. My love is forever. To you this I swore. I will quiet your silent screams, help heal your shattered soul, until once again, my love, you are whole, battle bare. Ashely, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
And why did you select those words?
I had written in my journal several times about letters to my husband with words that I just couldn't get out of my mouth, but I could get them down on paper, and just knowing what he must have been dealing with. You know, he was screaming and fighting a war inside of his head that no one else could hear, and so there's silent screams and just all of the brokenness. And you know, I mean, I really feel like soldiers have to cash in part of their humanity, part of their soul every time they deploy to protect freedom, whether you agree with the reason why we're in Afghanistan right now or not. You know, these guys make these sacrifices that they are then haunted with for the rest of their lives, and they feel like they're monsters and less of a person. And in the moment, whenever I was standing in front of my husband's workbench in the garage, tears streaming down my face, feeling like, you know, my husband's going to leave me because I've ruined his career because of some stupid family advocacy person manipulating my words. And it was like, all of a sudden, I just started writing, and they came out. And
okay, my last question to you is, have you ever been concerned that people will take this serious message and try to make it salacious or sexualize it?
Oh, I'm sure that they will, and I have so many people, thankfully, that are watching out to keep the reputation good that, you know, we're just going to address those issues as they come up and just ensure that it still stays the raw, powerful, non-sexually charged thing that it is, just so that people start talking.
And last question to you, if you could, in about 10 seconds, sum up, what do you want to ultimately accomplish?
ensure that the stigma of PTSD goes away, that people have hope, and they know that though there's not a cure, there is a way to get comfortable and be at peace with your new normal that is life with PTSD and married to someone with PTSD.
Ashely, I wish you all the very best, and thank you so much for being such a brave warrior yourself. Ashely Wise, thank you. Folks, we'll be right back on Storm Politics.
Written by local military wife and host of WYLN Storm Politics, Sleeping with Dog Tags hit Amazon.com's bestsellers list for military bio within weeks of its release. The author is donating a portion of the proceeds to the Rolling Angels for Armed Forces, a local organization that supports the military and military families. It's the perfect stocking stuffer for this holiday season. Purchase it in paperback now on Amazon.com or read it on Kindle or Barnes & Noble Nook.
Welcome back to Storm Politics. I am just so excited for my next guest to be calling in. Tony Seahorn is a very decorated Vietnam veteran. He is also the author of Tears of a Warrior, one of the best books ever written on the topic of PTSD, and he is joining us today from his home in Colorado. Thank you for calling in, Tony.
Well, it's good to be here, and we're having a fine sunny afternoon in the Rocky Mountain West.
Well, I appreciate that. We're having a fine sunny afternoon today here in Pennsylvania as well. Thank you so much. But unfortunately, PTSD is not a fine sunny thing. It's a difficult thing. It's a topic, and it's a disorder that a lot of families across this nation, a lot of returning veterans are living with and their families. Can you tell us a bit about your background and your connection to PTSD to start?
Yeah, I certainly will. I was born and raised in Wyoming in the wide open spaces, and about halfway through my second year of college, I decided that I needed a little different direction in my life, so I ended up going into the military. Initially, I had hoped to go into the Air Force. I'd always wanted to be a pilot, but as it turned out with the Vietnam War, a lot of activity with Uncle Sam's Army, so I ended up going into the U.S. Army. Completed considerable training there, and ended up getting my commission. And as a fairly new, young second lieutenant, was off to Vietnam like so many other young Americans were back then.
And you fought in some of the bloodiest wars, sadly, in the Vietnam War. So when you came home, I am sure that coming home was not an easy endeavor.
It wasn't. I mean, I think it's fairly common knowledge now that America was in the midst of a conflict over the war. Fortunately for me, because I grew up in a very patriotic family and I grew up in a very patriotic community, I didn't constantly encounter what many of the veterans did as far as being rejected when they came home, but I certainly was around it enough to get an appreciation. And of course, if you had your ear attuned at all to the media, you knew what was going on around you. So yeah, it was a very difficult time. And I think for those of us who fought in the war, were involved in the war, and felt that we were doing the right thing, serving our country, it was really difficult, not to be always accepted back in America.
Back then, post-traumatic stress, shell shock, whatever terms were used, wasn't discussed as openly and as comfortably as it is now. So did you feel you had resources back then and places that you can go to discuss the emotional wounds of war?
I was wounded in action pretty severely after 11 months of my tour of duty. And after I was wounded, I thought the real challenge was going to be recovering from those physical wounds of war. And even though that was an issue, and to some degree I still struggle with those, the real wound of war that just totally impacted my life and changed my life was post-traumatic stress. And we didn't know much about it. When I got out of the military and when I enrolled with the VA, basically the discussions back then were, you're lucky to be alive, you need to get on with things, and I didn't disagree with that. I wanted to get on with my life as well, but shortly thereafter, I started having, night sweats, nightmares, panic attacks, and that was the furthest thing from my mind, because I thought I was a tough guy from Wyoming, and we wouldn't be impacted by this thing that was called shell shock or combat fatigue. But it certainly impacted me.
And it's impacting, Tony. I mean, there's estimate, I know, from the Vietnam era, 25 to 30% of returning combat vets. They say certainly at least a third of the returning vets from Iraq and Afghanistan have PTSD as well.
Yeah, those are pretty high numbers, and it reflects also, and of course we're talking in this interview about combat PTSD, those who have actually served in combat. So if you look at those numbers, even though they're high, if you look at how it impacts those who actually have fought in battle, the numbers would actually be even higher for those individuals, because so many of those 25-30% numbers are based on overall deployment.
Right.
And, of course, not everyone who's deployed is exposed to the traumas of war.
No, that's true. That is true. Not everybody's outside the wire. Right.
Yeah, it runs those numbers even higher, which is really an eye-opener for just about everyone.
When you talk about night tremors and night sweats and things like that, what were some of the signs and symptoms that in addition to that you noticed, or that your wife, for example, noticed and has noticed over the years?
Well, for me, I had difficulty. It got so bad, I had difficulty trying to distinguish between reality and nightmares and dreams. I mean, one ran right over into the other. If you had nightmares at night, if somehow you got through the night, then the next day it continued on with you. And rapid heart rate, just you're ultra hypersensitive, just anything and everything seemed to impact you. But I think that the deep-seated effect that it had on me was not knowing what was going on. In other words, I always felt that I was a fairly strong individual, and as a young officer in Vietnam and being in a leadership role, I just didn't think things like this would impact me. And I think part of that denial of what's happening, or thinking I'd wake up one morning and it would end, made it even more difficult, because I resisted the emotion so much, and I found that the more I resisted, the worse it got.
Well, it's interesting, because you're going down a path, too, that I think a lot of returning soldiers, soldiers are tough. They're tough hombres.
Sure.
And it is sort of antithetical to your nature to want to admit to having vulnerability or having any kind of a perceived weakness, even though it's certainly not weakness at all. But I think that so many soldiers are not getting help for fear of that, and or for fear of impact upon their military career as well. Would you say?
Sure. I think I think you try to hide it. I mean, we think we're macho men, and once again, I'm just talking about men from my perspective, obviously men and women. But I think there's this tendency. I know I suppressed it because I immersed myself in other activities, like going back to school and completing my education, became immersed in my career and all of those activities around me. So you're kind of hiding from and trying to shield yourself from a lot of that psychological, emotional impact that it's having on you. So one way I learned to deal with the feelings was to essentially hide from them or try to suppress them.
We know you're a veteran of war who suffered from PTSD, but before the break, could you tell us about your wife's background?
We met after Vietnam. A lot of people ask, we know one another during my tour? No, we didn't. We met after I was discharged from the military. She was a young college graduate with her first year in teaching, and we met in the Denver area. And my wife has always been in education. She's what most of us would consider a high achiever. I mean, she really, I believe, makes a difference and excels in the classroom. So most of her career has been in teaching, elementary, and then she went into learning disabilities and gifted and talented programs. She ended up then getting her master's degree in just higher level education, and then in the 90s she went the next step and ended up going back to school and got her PhD.
Okay.
And specifically that's in the area of neuroscience, human development, focuses a lot on what makes kids tick, what makes people with disorders tick, if you will. And to some degree, that's been a blessing for me because my wife has not only been my supporter and my confidant, but she's also been one of my biggest critics. And I would have to say I've been her case study for the last 30-plus years.
As is the norm, Tony, for most married couples. Tony, we're going to have to take a quick break, but we're going to pick this up after the break. Folks, we'll be right back with Storm Politics. Welcome back. I'm speaking with Tony Seahorn, author of Tears of a Warrior. Tony, Tears of a Warrior is available, I mentioned in the opening of my show, at all VAs and vet centers and PTSD facilities nationwide. I think that's important for everybody to know. Can you just quickly tell us a little bit about some of the chemical changes that can go on in the body for a veteran suffering from PTSD?
Well, yes. I've found for myself, and I don't know you're talking specifically chemical changes, but yeah, there's just a lot of things that impact you when you're going through the emotional downside, and you know, anxiousness, irritability, not being able to sleep, hypersensitive. So there's a lot of things that seem to go on now. There are some medications available, and of course we all need to be treated as individuals, but some medications available that help all of those symptoms and can help balance, you know, some of those chemical changes. But
okay, and certainly it doesn't make any sense to have cortisol and adrenaline rushing through anybody's veins for that long a period of time. It's no wonder the veterans are suffering when they come home. Tony Seahorn, author of Tears of a Warrior, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's an honor to know you, friend.
Well, thank you. It was good joining you.
Thank you. And folks, I just, to close the show, want to put up my photo that I submitted to Battling Bear. I always tell you, don't complain about it, do something about it, and I did something about it. God bless our veterans. God bless their families. Thank you for watching.